This is my true story. My own son once looked at me and said, "You're dead to me." I had spent decades raising him, teaching him right from wrong, working hard so he could have a comfortable life, and giving him love that never wavered. Those words cut deeper than anything I had ever imagined. I felt betrayed, heartbroken, and powerless in that moment. But I knew I had to act. I couldn't let disrespect go unchecked. What I did next changed everything. Before I continue, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And please subscribe so my stories reach more people. I had spent my entire life putting my son first, believing that every choice I made, every hardship I endured, was to give him a better future. From the moment he was born, I felt a responsibility heavier than I could ever have imagined, yet I embraced it fully. Nights were often sleepless, rocking him back to calm when he cried, wiping away tears, comforting fevers, and worrying over his every need. I worked long hours at jobs that drained me physically and mentally, not for recognition, not for praise, but so that my son would never feel the hunger or fear I had once known. I remember rising before dawn, the cold air biting my skin, yet I pushed forward because I believed that the world could be kinder to him than it had been to me. Weekends were not for rest. They were for building memories, for guiding him, for teaching him lessons of respect, patience, and integrity that I hoped would remain in his heart forever. Every birthday, every small accomplishment, I celebrated with pride, masking my exhaustion with smiles and encouragement. I provided him with a home filled with care, even when money was tight, ensuring that he had everything he needed: books, toys, clothes, opportunities to learn, and the comfort of a stable life. I never asked for much in return. A simple word of gratitude, a glance of respect, or a moment of understanding would have been enough to remind me that my sacrifices had meaning. But more than material comforts, I gave him the intangible things I believed mattered most: guidance, principles, and love, unconditional. I taught him to stand up for himself, to act with honesty, and to respect others, often reminding him that integrity was worth more than fleeting pleasure or approval. I believed that over time, respect would grow naturally, that the lessons I instilled would form the foundation of his character. I believed that my love, patience, and devotion would be returned not only through his achievements, but also through his care for me in my old age. In my mind, this was the unshakable bond of father and son, the understanding that loyalty and love could weather any storm. I worked tirelessly, sometimes at jobs that left me aching and exhausted, sometimes sacrificing my own happiness so that he could pursue his dreams without worry. I stood as a silent guardian, watching over him, protecting him from mistakes where I could, and intervening when the consequences of the world threatened his innocence or well-being. I poured every ounce of energy, every piece of my heart, into shaping his world. I wanted him to succeed, to be strong, to be honorable. I never imagined that the very person I had nurtured, loved, and sacrificed for would one day turn his back on me, casting aside years of care and guidance with words that felt like knives in my chest. I believed that our bond was unbreakable, built on decades of shared life, trust, and love. I thought that he would recognize my devotion, that he would understand that I had given him everything because I wanted the best for him. And yet, when he said those words, I realized that all my sacrifices had been met with disdain, that my patience and love had been taken for granted, and that the respect I expected, the simple acknowledgement of a father's devotion, had been denied to me. I had built a life of care, support, and guidance for him, hoping that he would grow into a man who valued family, honor, and responsibility. I had hoped he would see my actions not as obligations, but as expressions of a love that could never falter. But in that moment, I understood that no amount of sacrifice could force someone to respect you, that love could be unappreciated, and that sometimes the lessons of a lifetime must be reinforced by consequences. I knew that I had given everything, yet I would not allow his disrespect to go unchallenged. My devotion had created the man he was, and now it was time for him to learn that actions have consequences, that words and betrayal can be met with justice, and that the foundation of respect is not built by mere affection, but by accountability. The first signs were subtle. almost imperceptible at first, and I told myself I might be imagining them. My son had grown, as all children do, and with growth came attitude, defiance, and occasional impatience. I noticed small moments where his tone was sharper than necessary, words that carried a sting I hadn't heard in years. At first, I brushed them off as mere expressions of youth, thinking he was testing boundaries or simply asserting independence. He began to interrupt me when I spoke, rolling his eyes when I offered advice, speaking over me in a way that had never been present during his childhood. Friends and neighbors began to hint at changes too, subtle remarks, sideways glances, a cautious word here and there about his growing disrespect. I remember listening quietly, feeling my heart tighten as I realized that my boy, the boy I had nurtured, guided, and protected, was becoming someone I barely recognized. I tried gentle correction at first, speaking calmly, explaining the importance of respect and manners, hoping that words of reason could steer him back to the path of humility and understanding. But the tone only worsened. He began mocking my experiences, my years of sacrifice, my very presence. What hurt the most was that he did not hesitate to do it publicly, in front of friends, in front of relatives, and even in front of strangers. He seemed to delight in the power he had over me, in the disbelief of others that I, his father, could be undermined in such a way. Each incident, though minor at first, built upon the last, forming a chain of disrespect that I could no longer ignore. The small insults, once easy to dismiss, accumulated like heavy stones in my chest, pressing down on the patience I had cultivated for decades. He began ignoring advice that was meant to protect him, dismissing guidance that had once been a lifeline. There were moments when I questioned myself, wondering if I had failed in some way, if my love, my patience, my care had not been enough. But deep down, I knew that his actions were a reflection of choice, not upbringing. I had provided everything: a safe home, education, moral guidance, and unconditional support. And yet, all of this seemed to have been met with arrogance and contempt. My son began openly defying house rules, staying out late without explanation, ignoring requests to help around the home, and using words that cut deeper than any physical discipline ever could. Each incident was a reminder that respect cannot be commanded. It must be earned and maintained, and when it is abandoned, consequences are inevitable. I observed the pattern for weeks, trying to remain calm, trying to reason with him, but every effort only seemed to escalate the defiance. I realized that his growing arrogance was not a phase, nor a youthful rebellion. It was a conscious choice. He tested limits not because he was unaware, but because he believed there would be no real consequences. I remember sitting late at night, thinking of the lessons I had tried to instill, replaying the countless hours I had spent guiding him, and feeling a painful awareness that words alone would no longer suffice. This growing disrespect was the first real warning that a breaking point was near, a signal that my patience had been exhausted and that a stronger measure was necessary. I knew that if I continued to let his arrogance go unchecked, he would never learn the weight of accountability, the importance of honoring those who had sacrificed for him, and the value of family bonds that I had worked a lifetime to protect. The first signs were subtle, but they were undeniable, and they marked the beginning of a path that would force me to make one of the hardest decisions of my life. The breaking point came quietly, almost like a shadow creeping across the walls, but when it struck hard. It was one of those ordinary evenings when I thought the day would end without incident, a day like any other, with small routines and familiar comfort. I tried to speak to him, to guide him gently, reminding him of responsibilities, small duties that a young man should honor within the family. But the response I received was not even a word of respect, not even a glance of acknowledgement. Instead, it came like a sudden, cold blade. "You're dead to me." His voice was sharp, deliberate, full of disdain, and it echoed in my ears long after it left his mouth. In that instant, decades of love, patience, and sacrifice seemed to crumble into dust. Every sleepless night, every long hour I had worked to provide for him, every piece of guidance I had given, all of it felt mocked by a single sentence. I stood there, frozen, hearing those words again and again in my mind, unable to reconcile the son I had raised with the one who now rejected me so completely. It was not only the words themselves, but the intention behind them. They carried cruelty that was deliberate, a prideful arrogance that dismissed everything I had done for him. I remembered the tiny infant who once clung to my chest, the boy who had laughed at my jokes, the child who had needed me and trusted me in all things. That boy seemed gone in an instant, replaced by someone I did not know, someone I could not reason with or comfort. My chest tightened, my hands shook, and yet I remained still, holding my composure, because I knew that reacting in anger would only fuel his sense of power. I had tried reasoning, I had tried patience, and I had tried silent endurance, but all of these methods had failed. In that moment, clarity struck me like a lightning bolt. Words alone could not correct this. Threats alone could not restore the balance that had been lost. I realized that the lesson had to be more than a lecture or a rebuke. It had to be something undeniable, something he could not twist or ignore. He needed to see the weight of his actions, feel the consequences of his disrespect, and understand that choices carry meaning far beyond momentary defiance. It was in that frozen moment, with his harsh words echoing around me, that I understood exactly what had to be done. The breaking point was not just an event, it was a revelation. It revealed the depth of the disrespect, the absence of gratitude, and the disregard for the sacrifices of a parent who had given everything. It was painful, more painful than any physical injury could have been, because it was an emotional strike, a betrayal of trust, and a rejection of love. I sat in silence for hours afterward, letting the shock settle into a burning resolve. Tears threatened to fall, but I refused them, knowing that my purpose could not be drowned in emotion. This was not merely about punishment. It was about teaching a lesson that would endure far longer than any argument could. I realized that this moment, this declaration of abandonment, had given me the clarity to act decisively. The breaking point, while devastating, became a turning point. It illuminated the path forward, showing me that action, measured and purposeful, was the only way to restore balance, to impress upon him the importance of respect, and to protect the family he had sought to undermine. The words, "You're dead to me," would not define our relationship unless I allowed them to. Instead, they became the catalyst for change. The moment I chose a course of action that would echo for years, leaving a lasting impression that respect and accountability are not optional, and that love, while patient, must be met with honor, not disdain. The breaking point was painful, but it was also necessary. It was the moment that set in motion the decision that would reclaim dignity, restore order, and leave a lesson that he, and everyone around him, could never forget. After the words, "You're dead to me," echoed through the room, silence fell, heavy and suffocating. I sat alone in my chair, my body still, but my mind racing with every memory, every moment I had invested in raising my son. The quiet was not comforting. It was filled with the weight of betrayal and disbelief. I thought back to the sleepless nights I endured, working long hours to ensure he had warmth, food, and education. I remembered the cold mornings when I went without breakfast so he could eat, the long evenings when I returned home exhausted, yet forced a smile to greet him, the times I patiently corrected mistakes and soothed his fears. Each memory now carried a bitter sting because all of it had been dismissed, mocked, and thrown aside with his cruel declaration. I realized that for all the love and patience I had given, respect had not grown in return. I felt an emptiness that was deeper than any physical wound. My son's rejection was not just a refusal of my authority. It was a denial of the bond we had built over decades, a denial of the sacrifices I had made without complaint. In the quiet, I let the pain wash over me, acknowledging it fully instead of suppressing it. I did not cry aloud. I did not shout. I simply let the reality settle in, understanding that this was a moment that demanded clarity, not reaction. Anger began to rise within me, sharp and hot, but I did not let it take control. I knew that anger alone could not teach him a lesson. It would only feed his sense of power and defiance. I had to think carefully, to plan with precision, because this was more than a single incident. It was a pattern of disrespect that could not continue. I reflected on the years I had given him, the trust I had placed in him, and the expectations I had quietly held. I understood that love without respect is fragile, and patience without consequences is meaningless. My heart ached, not for my own suffering, but for the failure of my son to understand the weight of his actions and the importance of family bonds. I realized that the lesson I needed to impart had to be undeniable and public, something he could not ignore, twist, or deny. It had to be a moment he, and everyone around him, would remember, so that the next time he thought of defiance, he would think first of accountability. In that silence, I began to map out the steps I would take. I considered the evidence of his reckless behavior, the repeated incidents of defiance, and the lack of remorse that had defined his recent years. I knew that involving authorities was not a matter of punishment alone. It was a way to demonstrate that actions have consequences, that respect cannot be demanded through words alone, and that accountability is necessary for the preservation of family and dignity. I allowed myself a moment to breathe, to let the fire of determination replace the heat of anger. The quiet reflection turned my heartbreak into purpose, my pain into strategy. I understood that the lesson had to be executed with patience and precision, without haste, without emotion clouding judgment. I realized that this was no longer about my personal hurt. It was about setting a precedent, showing that disrespect has limits and that betrayal of trust carries consequences. I sat through the night, letting each thought crystallize until I felt a calm resolve settle over me. The silent reflection transformed me from a father wounded by words into a man prepared to take decisive action. I was no longer merely a victim of his cruelty. I was a planner of justice, ready to use the power I still held to teach the lesson he had ignored for too long. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every moment of patience now had a purpose: to restore balance, demand respect, and leave a lasting imprint on his memory and conscience. That night, in silence, I found clarity, determination, and a way forward. The lesson would be taught, and it would be unforgettable. After hours of reflection, the path forward became clear. I understood that confronting my son with anger, yelling, or punishment alone would achieve nothing. He would deny everything, twist my words, and likely continue believing he could act without consequences. The years of patience I had shown, the sacrifices I had made, all would be dismissed in the fire of his arrogance. I realized that the lesson had to be undeniable in a way that he could not escape or misinterpret. It had to be visible, public, and lasting, so that the moment would sink deep into his memory and reshape his behavior permanently. I reviewed the patterns of his defiance, the reckless acts that had gone uncorrected, and the moments when he had mocked my guidance or ignored my authority. Each incident reinforced the decision that the time for gentle correction had passed. What remained was the need for a decisive act, one that would speak louder than words, one that would teach respect through consequence rather than confrontation. I weighed my options carefully. Calling the police was not an act of vengeance fueled by anger. It was a strategic move to ensure accountability. The authorities would serve as impartial witnesses, turning my plan into a reality that he could not argue against. I considered other methods: private scolding, grounding, taking privileges, but I realized these would fail to leave the indelible mark required. The lesson needed to be stark, undeniable, and visible, not just to him, but to those who mattered: his children, his peers, and the neighbors who had seen his growing arrogance. I began gathering evidence meticulously, not out of spite, but to document a history of reckless behavior that could not be denied. Each note, each record, each incident was cataloged with precision, creating a clear picture of the pattern of disrespect he had cultivated over time. I understood that a father's role was not only to love, but to teach, and sometimes the teaching required measures far beyond gentle words or private guidance. I reminded myself that this decision was not about humiliation for its own sake, but about creating a turning point in his life, a moment that could alter the trajectory of his actions and restore order to the family he had disrespected. I imagined the process: the call to the authorities, their arrival, the presence of witnesses, and the undeniable display of consequence. I envisioned my son's arrogance fading, replaced by the weight of responsibility and the beginning of understanding. This mental rehearsal gave me calm, replacing the heat of anger with clarity of purpose. I acknowledged the personal cost, the heartbreak, the lingering pain, but weighed it against the importance of the lesson. I knew that allowing him to continue unchecked would only deepen the pattern of disrespect, eroding the family structure and undermining the values I had spent a lifetime instilling. I reminded myself that love is sometimes not enough. Respect must be enforced, and accountability must be visible. My decision crystallized into a plan executed with care, patience, and precision. I would involve the authorities, present the evidence clearly, and allow the natural process of consequence to unfold. His children would witness, not for cruelty, but to understand that actions have consequences and that their father's behavior could not go unchallenged. I resolved to remain calm throughout the process, to let the truth and the consequences speak for themselves. There would be no shouting, no threats, no unnecessary drama, only the unshakable weight of accountability. In that moment, I embraced a sense of resolve deeper than anger. I was no longer a father crushed by words. I was a father prepared to enforce justice with wisdom and foresight. The decision was no longer theoretical. It was ready to be enacted, precise, deliberate, and enduring. This was not vengeance. It was a necessary measure to restore respect, order, and the recognition that family bonds come with responsibility. That night, clarity replaced heartbreak. Purpose replaced despair. And I knew that the lesson I was about to teach would resonate far beyond a single moment, shaping the behavior and understanding of my son and his children for years to come. The time for passive patience had ended, and the era of deliberate, measured consequence was beginning. The next morning, I prepared to take action. I gathered every piece of evidence I had collected over the past weeks. Notes, records of reckless behavior, any proof that showed the repeated disrespect and dangerous actions, all organized carefully in a folder. Each page told a story. Each detail documented a pattern, leaving no room for argument or denial. I reviewed everything multiple times to ensure nothing was missing, nothing that could weaken the case. My heart was heavy, but my mind was clear. This was not an act of malice. It was an act of necessity. I understood that filing a report with the authorities was the only way to create consequences that would be visible, lasting, and undeniable. The law would serve as the impartial enforcer, making sure that the lesson was both real and irreversible. I drove calmly to the police station, the folder resting on the passenger seat, each document a representation of years of sacrifice and patience now challenged by disregard. Upon arrival, I approached the desk with clarity, explained the situation as factually as possible, and presented the evidence in a straightforward manner. There was no anger in my voice, no accusations that could be twisted. I knew that to ensure effectiveness, the process needed to be calm, measured, and methodical. The officers listened, asked questions, and documented everything with precision. I felt a mixture of relief and sadness as the process began. Relief because action was finally being taken, and sadness because a bond that had taken decades to build had been eroded by disrespect and rebellion. Yet, I reminded myself repeatedly that this step was necessary. Filing the report was not about vengeance, it was about accountability. It was about sending a message that disrespect, defiance, and reckless behavior cannot continue unchecked. I knew my son would face embarrassment, but it was a lesson far more important than momentary shame. I explained to the officers the patterns of his behavior, detailing the incidents, the words, and the repeated warnings I had given. Everything was factual, everything verifiable. I wanted to ensure that when the process unfolded, there could be no question of fairness. It was important that the lesson was legitimate, not tainted by bias or emotion. After the report was filed, I left the station with a strange mixture of calm and anticipation. I knew the wheels of justice would turn, that the authorities would investigate and act according to procedure. And in that act, the respect and order that had been absent in my household for too long would begin to re-establish themselves. I thought about my son's children, imagining how they would perceive the events. They needed to witness the consequences, to understand that actions have effects, and that words like, "You're dead to me," carried weight beyond mere emotion. I reminded myself that sometimes love requires harsh measures, and discipline requires visibility. Filing the report was the first step, a deliberate move that transformed my private struggle into a visible, undeniable lesson. Each page in that folder represented years of patience, care, and devotion now met with disregard, yet also now turned into the tool of education. I walked home slowly, knowing that the next steps would be carried out by law, but that the impact of my actions would resonate immediately. This act, this filing, was not the end. It was the catalyst. The lesson would unfold naturally, with the law as the impartial guide, the public as witnesses, and the consequences as undeniable truth. In that moment, I felt a quiet strength. I had chosen action over despair, method over emotion, and accountability over blind patience. The report was not just a legal document. It was a turning point, a chance to restore order, respect, and understanding in a household that had drifted into chaos. I understood fully that the lesson would sting, that my son would feel the weight of his choices, and that his children would see and remember. But this was necessary. This was not cruelty. This was a father enforcing the fundamental truth that respect is earned, and that actions, even words, carry consequences that cannot be ignored. And with that knowledge, I felt a sense of calm resolve, ready for the next stage of ensuring the lesson was not forgotten. Within minutes of filing the report, the police arrived at our home. The flashing lights and quiet hum of the engine drew the attention of the neighbors, who began to peek from their windows and doorways, whispering to each other. I felt no fear, only a steady calm. I had prepared for this moment mentally for weeks. My son, who had once thrown words like daggers, now faced the reality of his actions. The officers approached with measured professionalism, explaining the process clearly and calmly. I stood silently behind them, my presence firm yet unobtrusive. My son's initial defiance faltered when he realized that these men were not negotiable, that their authority was absolute. The metal cuffs clamped onto his wrists, cold and unyielding, and I could see the weight of the situation sink in immediately. He struggled briefly, but it was futile. The rebellion that had dominated our home, that had emboldened him to speak with arrogance and disrespect, evaporated in the face of undeniable authority. I watched quietly as the officers guided him outside. Neighbors had begun to gather, murmurs growing louder as the scene unfolded in their line of sight. Their eyes were on him, and I could feel the weight of public accountability settling on my son's shoulders. For years, he had thought that words alone could shield him from consequences, that pride could replace responsibility. But now, with the flashing lights reflecting off the windows and his hands restrained, he faced the truth in the most tangible, undeniable way. I did not need to shout. I did not need to scream. Every motion, every click of the cuffs, every step he took under the watchful eyes of the police and neighbors spoke volumes. Respect was returning, not through anger, not through punishment alone, but through the undeniable reality of consequence. His arrogance melted into fear and shock, a lesson far more effective than any words I could have uttered. I felt a complex mixture of emotions, sorrow for the path that had led him here, relief that the lesson was finally being learned, and satisfaction that decades of patience had not been wasted. The officers walked him through the small front yard, each step visible to the community he had often tried to impress with his defiance. I noticed heads shaking, whispers spreading from one neighbor to the next, all eyes witnessing the moment when privilege and arrogance met reality. My son's pride had collapsed in the space of minutes, replaced by an understanding that actions carry consequences far beyond the private walls of our home. I remained calm, my face neutral, my body steady. I did not need to gloat, nor did I need to express anger. The scene itself was the teacher, and the lesson was immediate. The weight of the cuffs, the attention of the community, the presence of the police, all converged to create a lesson that no lecture, no punishment at home could ever replicate. My son's children, observing from the doorway and nearby windows, stared with wide eyes. They witnessed their father humbled, restrained, and accountable in a way that could not be dismissed. The lesson was clear. Disrespect, arrogance, and reckless behavior cannot exist without consequences. I could see their confusion, their shock, but also the understanding forming that the world does not allow harmful actions to continue unchecked. I did not speak. I did not gesture. Silence held the power. Silence amplified the lesson. Each moment, as the officers guided him into the police vehicle, solidified the truth that respect is earned, that words carry weight, and that choices, especially reckless ones, have immediate and visible consequences. And as the car door closed and the engine started, I stood tall, knowing that the moment would be remembered, that the lesson would remain with both my son and his children for years to come. Public accountability had restored order, and with that, a quiet peace settled over me. The father who had endured insult, heartbreak, and defiance, yet acted with clarity, resolve, and justice. As the police officers guided my son into the patrol car, his children watched from the front window and the doorway, their young faces frozen in a mixture of shock, confusion, and disbelief. They had always seen him as strong, confident, and untouchable, a figure who ruled the household with his words and whims. But now, their perception of power and authority was challenged in the most direct way possible. Their father, whom they had admired and, in many ways, feared, was restrained by handcuffs, unable to continue his tantrums, and held accountable in front of the entire neighborhood. I stayed silent, observing them closely, knowing that this lesson was not just for my son, it was also for the next generation. Children absorb more from seeing reality than from hearing words. I wanted them to witness the truth. Arrogance, disrespect, and the belief that actions have no consequences would always meet boundaries eventually. Their eyes followed every movement. The careful handling of my son by the officers, the faint clink of metal as the cuffs adjusted, the slight struggle of resistance that quickly turned into compliance. The weight of the lesson settled over them gradually, like a quiet storm they could not escape. I could see their young minds connecting the dots, the shouting, the harsh words, the dismissive attitude, and now the very real accountability before their eyes. For years, they had perhaps thought that rebellion could succeed without consequence, that disrespect could slide under the radar as long as their father was strong. But that illusion was gone now, shattered by the combination of legal authority and the watchful presence of the community. Each whisper and gasp from the neighbors outside amplified the reality for them, showing that the consequences of behavior extend beyond the private walls of a home. I felt no malice toward them. I only wanted them to learn. They were the witnesses to the moment when justice, fairness, and responsibility finally intersected with arrogance and defiance. I could see the fear in their eyes, but also the understanding that actions carry weight, that choices matter, and that respect is not optional, even for those closest to us. Their father, once seemingly untouchable, was now a lesson in humility. I wanted them to carry this memory into adulthood, to know that disrespect and recklessness could never go unchecked, and that accountability is always inevitable, whether immediate or delayed. The neighborhood around us, buzzing with whispers and curious glances, reinforced the impact of the event. The children realized that the eyes of the world, not just their home, could observe behavior and judge consequences. Every glance they cast at their father, every reaction of surprise and fear, solidified the lesson more than words ever could. In their silence, I saw comprehension, the kind that forms slowly but lasts a lifetime. I did not speak because nothing I could say would match the clarity of the truth unfolding before them. Their father's arrest, his restrained hands, the attention of the neighbors, and the calm determination in my own presence, all of it worked together as a living lesson in morality, respect, and the repercussions of one's choices. I wanted them to carry this knowledge forward, to understand that rebellion and arrogance without accountability can bring shame, fear, and regret. As the officers closed the patrol car doors and prepared to leave, the children's expressions remained etched in my mind. The mix of shock, reflection, and understanding that this was more than punishment. It was an education in life's harsh realities. This was the moment where respect was taught not through lectures, but through action. Public exposure, observed by their own eyes, ensured the lesson would remain permanent. In that moment, I felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that my son had received justice, that his children had seen the consequences of his choices, and that future generations in our family would understand the weight of words and actions. I turned slowly, standing tall and calm, knowing the message had been delivered, not with anger, not with threats, but with undeniable truth, observed by those who would remember it longest: his children. After the officers left, taking my son with them for processing and a formal warning, the house felt different. Silence replaced the usual tension, and the air was heavy with reflection rather than argument. The children, still staring from the doorway and windows, slowly retreated inside, their minds processing what they had witnessed. I stayed calm, letting the reality sink in without adding any commentary. The lesson had already been taught. Every day of his defiance, every disrespectful word, every mocking gesture now contrasted sharply with the consequences they had just seen. My son returned home hours later, chastened and subdued, the weight of the event pressing upon him. His usual arrogance had vanished, replaced by caution and uncertainty. He avoided eye contact, spoke quietly, and for the first time in many years, I sensed a trace of humility. The household itself shifted. Rooms that were once filled with tension, sharp words, and occasional threats became quieter. Even minor disputes were now approached with care, as everyone, including my son, understood that actions carry weight and that authority and responsibility demand respect. The children seemed to move more cautiously, observing their father's behavior with a new awareness, while also watching my reactions to gauge expectations. They learned that strength is not in loud words or defiance, but in respect, patience, and the understanding of consequences. Over the next days, I noticed small, meaningful changes. My son, once quick to interrupt, now paused before speaking. He listened rather than dismissed. He showed minor gestures of courtesy that were long overdue. I did not rush these changes, because true respect cannot be forced. It grows slowly when lessons are understood deeply. I continued my daily life, maintaining calm authority, reinforcing boundaries without raising my voice. The incident had made clear that patience paired with decisive action could shape behavior far more effectively than anger or punishment alone. I realized the power of consequence, the ability to demonstrate reality to a stubborn mind in a way that could not be ignored. Neighbors still whispered occasionally, curious about the arrest, but the whispers only reinforced the lesson for the children. The story would remain with them, a living example of accountability. The son, now subdued, had to rebuild trust with his own children, who were processing their father's moment of humiliation alongside the lesson they would carry forever. I observed their interactions, noting that subtle glances and small corrections now replaced brash defiance. The weight of authority and consequence had been restored in the household. It was not about revenge or anger. It was about correction and the establishment of a moral framework that could not be ignored. I felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that the lesson had been imparted with precision and care, without the need for shouting, lectures, or humiliation beyond what truth required. The family dynamic shifted in ways that words alone could never achieve. Actions, witnessed and understood, had replaced chaos with order. The respect that had once been absent gradually returned, and the children learned that life's lessons could come suddenly and unexpectedly, but would be remembered forever. Through this measured approach, the household regained balance, and I regained the quiet dignity of a father whose duty had been fulfilled. In the weeks that followed, the changes remained consistent. My son, though still learning, no longer treated me with disregard. Conversations became calmer, instructions were followed with less resistance, and the children observed, understanding the importance of responsibility, respect, and the consequences of choices. The aftermath proved that justice, when delivered thoughtfully and with patience, could reshape behavior and instill lessons more deeply than anger ever could. I watched silently, content in knowing that what had begun as heartbreak and disrespect had been transformed into a foundation of understanding and respect that would last for years. Now, as an old man, I look back on that day with calm and clarity, not anger. Time has softened the sting of my son's harsh words, but it has also reinforced the lesson I had to teach. I understand now that love alone cannot demand respect, and patience, while powerful, must sometimes be paired with decisive action. That day, when he said, "You're dead to me," it could have broken me entirely if I had let my emotions take control. Instead, I chose strategy over anger and truth over fleeting satisfaction. I knew that allowing his disrespect to go unchecked would only embolden him further and perhaps even damage the foundation of the family for generations. It was not a choice made out of malice or revenge. It was a choice made out of necessity, of responsibility, and of a father's love that wanted to correct before it was too late. Watching him in handcuffs, seen by his own children, was not cruel. It was a mirror reflecting the consequences of his behavior. They witnessed firsthand that actions, no matter how private or thoughtless, eventually have outcomes. I think often about what the children must have felt in that moment, seeing their father humbled and controlled by the law, realizing that no one is above accountability. That sight, as painful as it was for everyone involved, became the most enduring lesson I could give them. Over the years, I have seen how this lesson shaped the family. My son, humbled and reflective, began to understand boundaries, respect, and the meaning of authority. He made small changes in his behavior, gradually regaining some trust. The children, however, carried the memory of that day as a guidepost for their own lives, understanding that disrespect and defiance can have real consequences. I have come to realize that the weight of a father's responsibility is not only to provide and nurture, but also to instill values, sometimes through hard and uncomfortable lessons. Love is patient, but it is not always enough to enforce respect. Discipline, demonstrated in a measured and thoughtful way, can teach far more than words or scolding ever could. In sharing this story now, I want others to understand that sometimes the hardest actions are the most necessary. A father's duty is not to be liked in the moment, but to be effective in shaping character and instilling understanding. I have no regrets about the path I chose. My son's defiance and harsh words were unacceptable, and if left unchecked, could have spiraled into deeper problems for him and for the family. By acting decisively and thoughtfully, I was able to restore balance, enforce respect, and provide a lesson that would last far longer than anger or yelling ever could. I often reflect on the quiet power of truth and consequence. The handcuffs were not a tool of cruelty. They were a reflection of reality, a visible symbol of accountability. My own emotions were kept in check, and in doing so, I preserved my dignity and authority. In life, we sometimes face moments where love alone cannot correct behavior. It is in those moments that patience, strategy, and moral courage intersect. That day, I demonstrated to my son and to his children that respect must be earned, that words can wound, and that actions have consequences. And now, many years later, I see the fruits of that decision. The family home regained peace, the children grew up understanding accountability, and my role as a father remained intact, not through fear or punishment, but through the careful application of justice and consequence. The lesson has endured far longer than anger ever could. I tell this story not to boast, but to share a principle that is hard yet necessary. Love guides, but consequences teach. Discipline, when delivered with patience and fairness, leaves an imprint that endures through generations. My final thought is this. He said I was dead to him. That day, he learned that respect is not optional, and that actions, even those fueled by anger or defiance, will always have their consequences. As I recount these events, I hope others understand that the most powerful lessons are not always spoken. They are witnessed, felt, and remembered. In the end, dignity, calm, and the courage to act decisively are what define a father's strength, and they are what truly shape the future of a family.